Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest webinar from OMDIA. Today's topic is automated testing, giving time and money back to game developers. Our webinar is co-sponsored by OMDIA and our partner GameDriver. My name is Liam Deane, Principal Analyst with OMDIA, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. So today's webinar, we are going to give you some insights from a recent survey we've conducted of game developers, the challenges that they're facing, and in particular, how that relates to testing and automation, where we'll also get some insights from the GameDriver team. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your console are multiple application widgets that you can use. Make sure that you check out these during the webinar. A copy of today's slide deck and other valuable resources are available to download in the resource list widget. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A widget located on the left side of your screen. All questions will be captured, so if we don't answer you, we may follow up by email. An on-demand version of the webinar will be available approximately 24 hours from now and can be accessed through the same link that was sent to you earlier that you used to access this webinar today. Finally, if you have any technical difficulties, just click on the help widget where you can find answers to some common questions. Now, let me introduce you to our panel. Today, I'm joined by Shane Evans, Chief Product Officer, and John Pattee, Content Marketing Specialist with GameDriver. Welcome, Shane and John. How are you doing today?
Well, thanks. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thank you for having us.
Looking forward to getting into it. So let's dive straight in. So we're going to start off by looking at the findings from the survey that I've already mentioned. So this is a survey that we conducted in September of this year of 76 game developers around the world. So we can see that it is a mixture of people working in different functions at game studios. The leading number are in software engineering, but also a good mix across art and design, PM, senior management, and so on. And as this is mainly focused on the topic of testing, we have predominantly people who are involved in testing to some degree or another. 41% of these respondents are primarily testing people, but we also have people who are a little bit more distant, working in other roles that are only somewhat related to testing at game studios. So we have a little bit of perspective from them as well. Geographically, the majority of our respondents were in North America, to just give some additional context on the findings you're going to see, with the rest mainly coming from Europe and Asia Pacific. And we also have a good mix of company sizes in there, from small indie studios up to medium size, and 30% or so from big studios of more than 500 people. So the first question that we asked in this survey was, what is the biggest challenge, or what do you think are the biggest challenges for game developers right now? So just trying to get a feeling of the temperature. What are the big issues that game developers are seeing in the industry at the moment? And it probably won't come as much of a surprise to anyone in the industry that the #1 result here was hiring the right talent. We know this is a huge issue at the moment. But strikingly, the second biggest concern we have here is around testing and quality assurance. Now, granted, as I already mentioned, this is a sample of people who are predominantly involved in testing, so they're likely to have that a bit more front of mind maybe than some other people. But nonetheless, it's still very striking to see that kind of right up there alongside or even ahead of huge issues like user retention, acquisition, controlling development costs. So we can really see that this is a big issue for game developers these days.
Just a comment here, Liam. I thought this was interesting, particularly because it shows that other than the #1 concern, after quality, the top 3 out of 5 all have to do with quality, and arguably so does the first. And so if we took a holistic view of this and thought about what are some of the underlying causes for some of these concerns, a lot of it does relate back to quality.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we can see how these are interrelated, and there can even be 3 layers to it. Say a loop of hiring and issues around testing, QA, and all impacting back onto some of the other ones we're seeing here. So it's, yeah, it's an interesting picture when you start putting it all together. So if we look then at the types of tools that developers are using, just kind of understand like what are the solutions that are out there that are being used to, to address these challenges in general, to kind of tackle the business of game development. We can see a really wide variety. I think we gave a bunch of different options to the survey respondents. On average, they picked more than 5 that were being used. So we can see top of the list here, of course, we have core development tools, game engines, art animation, and so on. Striking that testing comes relatively low down here. So we're talking here about external tools. Automated testing, 41%, one of the less used tools. So we can see it's relatively far down as far as penetration in the market today is concerned. And bear that in mind when we look at this from the perspective of investment levels as well. We kind of see something that kind of reinforces some of the same picture. So when we break down by do developers think that they are spending a great deal, a moderate amount, or just a little on each of these different kinds of tools? And we see when we look at game engines over here in the list, a lot of deep purple in there. That's obviously something that we see a lot of developers finding that is, that's a big cost that they're facing as studios. What's interesting, again, we see some others that are not perceived as so expensive, with kind of a bit more blue on these bars: payment and billing, account and identity management, and also testing again here with kind of a fairly high percentage of users of those tools not perceiving them to be very expensive or burdensome in terms of cost. So I guess you can look at that in multiple ways. Maybe it's a sign of underinvestment. Maybe it's a sign of perceptions of good value. I think, as we'll see a little bit later on, we see kind of some more evidence which can guide us a bit more on that. But as well as external tooling, something else that's important to think about when we're thinking about the different functions that make up a game studio is what is being done internally versus what is being outsourced to various kinds of support services beyond the studio itself. So we asked how likely developers were to outsource different kinds of functions. And we can see on the left here, audio and art creation and localization at the top of the list of the functions most likely to be outsourced. And testing and QA quite high up there as well. Also kind of popular targets for outsourcing. And when we dig down a little bit more in this chart on the right as to the reasons for that, there's some quite interesting results there that we see the #1 reason is reducing costs, followed by a sense that outsourced providers have a greater efficiency and scale than developers have internally. But then if we look further down the list, it's striking that concerns about expertise, for instance, outsourced providers have greater expertise. That's much, much lower, only 28%. So it doesn't seem to be so much that developers feel that they lack the capacity or that they think that outsourced providers are doing a better job. They just think, for the most part, that this is a way of reducing costs and gaining efficiencies. But there's actually some more complexity here if we think about in practice how outsourced providers would be used in a game development studio. So we kind of drilled down a bit more into who is actually in charge of testing functions at your company as a respondent to this survey. So predominantly it's a dedicated testing team or department. But not uncommonly in combination with individual teams or other teams also helping out. And then when we look at internal versus external, we also see a tendency to mix and match. So there's a group over here on the right which are entirely or very much leaning towards internal, but the biggest option here is about half of respondents would describe testing at their studio as a mixture of internal and external. There was actually an option in the survey to say not just largely external, but entirely external. There were 0 responses for that one. So in practice, when we're talking about outsourcing, we're talking about supporting internal functions, not entirely replacing them. And I think we can kind of color this picture a bit more by looking at the types of testing that are being used and some kind of trends related to that. So we asked, what are the different types of testing employed at your company? And we see kind of a pretty wide variety of answers for each option here, a high percentage answering yes. So no surprise to see the likes of functional testing, performance testing, very high yes percentages there, almost 90%. But even more complex techniques like integration and regression testing are not too far behind. So the typical picture is that a lot of different types of testing are being done. And we asked as well, how much in terms of time and money are these different kinds of testing costing at your company? And what we see is actually quite a lot of variation here. So when we look over at functional testing, there's very high proportions of respondents here consider that it's costing a lot either in terms of effort or in terms of money to handle that kind of testing at their company. Whereas some other types of testing, notably performance testing here, we see a lot of blue here. Most people are doing it, but they're more likely to find it not so burdensome. So it's very much it's a mixed picture. It depends what sort of testing we're talking about. It's really a variety of different topics rather than a single monolith, which is something that comes through as well when we asked developers to talk a little bit more about how they used automation in relation to the different types of testing that were being done at their company. So first of all, in terms of overall processes, we see a kind of a familiar picture here on this pie chart on the left about whether they were more likely to use manual or automated functions. So leaning perhaps a bit more towards manual with a certain proportion saying entirely or largely manual. But predominantly the most common, again, is to use a kind of mix and match approach with both manual and automation testing employed. But interestingly, it does vary quite a bit depending on the type of testing that we're talking about, as we can see in the second chart here on the right. So for instance, regression testing, very much more likely to be manual, with a majority saying that they're doing that entirely manually, only quite a small percentage, 5%, saying that that is an automated function. Whereas if we look down at the bottom of the chart at performance testing, very much flipped around, more likely to be automated than entirely manual. So again, we see how it's very much dependent on exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about testing, and that has different implications for everything from hiring to outsourcing to automation. So we also wanted to get a sense of kind of the trends where things are going from a forward-looking perspective when it comes to testing and test automation in particular. So we asked about how much automation had been, or use of automated testing had been increased or decreased in current projects relative to previous ones. And what we see is nobody at all in this survey says they're reducing their use of automation testing. Things just are not moving in that direction. There is a certain percentage that are saying the same amount, but the vast majority, 76%, are increasing their use of automation testing compared compared to where they are in the past. So we can see that things are very much moving in the direction of more automation. But at the same time, we saw earlier that it's a bit of a slow process, and particularly for certain kinds of testing, there's still a long way to go in terms of automation. So to understand a bit more about why that is, we also probed around the reasons for not implementing more automation testing. And usually it's perception that it would be too difficult to implement. That's the number one reason. Then that's followed by concerns about expense, but it's striking to see the perception of difficulty in implementation as coming up top there. But that provides an interesting contrast with when we looked specifically at those developers who were already using automation testing, how satisfied that they were with those tools, and the vast majority are satisfied. So more than 80% consider themselves highly or somewhat satisfied with their automation testing tools. More than 70% say that it's a big improvement on manual testing that they were doing before. Everyone agrees essentially that it is at least an improvement of some amount. So it's a very clear picture there that when automation comes in, it never really goes out. Everyone can see the improvements that come along with automating a bit more of those processes. So to dive into that in a little bit more detail, I'm going to hand over to one of our experts from the GameDriver team, John Pattee, who I introduced earlier. John, do you want to take us through some more of these, the finer points of test automation?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much, Liam, for sharing these results. And also thank you for the hard work you and the rest of the OMDIA team have put into doing the research. So yeah, from GameDriver's point of view, we really wanted to jump in today and bring forward our experience to these results. Internally at GameDriver, from the co-founders down to everybody else developing the product, there's a combined decades of experience in quality assurance and testing, product management, and other relevant sectors and key pieces of expertise. And with that, we just hopefully want to paint a clear picture of everything, add some context to the numbers we've just gone through with Liam, and maybe really hopefully clear up some misconceptions or any fears around adopting test automation into your game's development. And yeah, we really want to start with that barrier to entry. As Liam just said, nearly half of the respondents, as the top answer said, that test automation is too hard to implement, and that's what's sort of keeping them off from that. Now, we can understand that perspective, especially as something's new, a newer practice in a fairly established space. But we also think while gaming has its own unique challenges and practices, it's still important to look out at other forms of tech. Places like things like web and mobile app development. Those counterparts have had these kinds of tools implemented for decades now. It is absolutely common practice, second nature in their QA pipelines. And so we think it's about high time that gaming adopts similar things and sort of tries to keep up with that pace. And given our experience in those areas, that's why we wanted to bring over some of the tools and established processes that are already used there and see how we can put them into game development to make test automation in games a much more accessible thing to accomplish. So we definitely think that the barrier for entering is probably less daunting than you may think.
And why do you think that is, John, that developers have maybe a bit of a tendency to feel that barrier might be more intimidating than it really is?
Yeah, well, at least in some of the conversations we've had at events and conferences or in any other way with potential customers and people interested, it's, there's been a mix of maybe some of the testers they currently have maybe don't have some of the more technical coding-based skills to adapt, or they're perceived as just not being able to have that ability. There's sort of some underestimating happening at times. And at least from GameDriver's perspective, we can speak to our language that we use, the proprietary tech we use, which is HPath. But for anybody else who's familiar with web application-based testing and Selenium, there's actually a lot of similarities in the syntax. And why we wanted to do that and why we find that so important is, again, about that accessibility. Those similarities and that overlap means there's going to be a lot more documentation and a lot more resources and information out there and already available to sort of bridge that gap a lot more simply. Yeah, and in the cases of, we've seen with cases of new customers learning HPath, it's definitely not as exhaustive as you may fear. We've suggested to customers maybe there's anywhere from 2 to 4 hour long courses to get people started. And then the test automation really just adapts to the existing test frameworks that studios have. And it's a lot more of a seamless process than some people think. Another one of those issues was that complex picture that Liam painted with about the mix of internal teams versus external outsourced services. No matter where you fall on that mix, though, whether it's 80 to 20% in favor of external or anything vice versa in between, we still think that supporting and prioritizing better tooling for your internal team should absolutely be a priority. A lot of respondents listed greater scale and efficiency as a top reason for outsourcing. And while that can absolutely be the case, why not have your internal teams better equipped to keep up with that? And once again, given that test automation can just exist within current established frameworks, that's also a lot less of a logistical hassle. So I think I could speak for anybody involved in that situation. Any logistical burden that's reduced is probably happier for everyone involved on the team, and hopefully increases productivity in those key sprints too.
And do you think that some of those resources that are being put towards outsourcing could maybe be more productively employed doing more test automation instead?
I can answer that. And so whether we see whether the automation is happening within the internal teams that are closer to the developers and have that direct interaction, or if it's being done by a third party, it's really about scaling. And so automation really allows testers to break free from the limitation of being able to test one thing at a time, and really only having two hands. I can only play one game at a time and test one scenario at a time. So if I can automate those things that are repetitive and need to be executed maybe every single build, every cycle, then I can focus my efforts on other areas. So whether it's being done by internal teams or external, I think that the benefit's the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do think that the payoff is absolutely worth it. Once again, touching on the numbers, we saw that satisfaction rate, 71% saying there's a big improvement after using test automation, and a really great 84% that are satisfied with their choice in test automation. Now, obviously, that success and the metrics behind those improvements are going to be different for everybody across the board. But to paint a picture with one of our customers, we want to talk about In-Context Solutions. They're a global leader in 3D simulation software for retail, and they've been using GameDriver for a fair bit amount of time now. And throughout their implementation, to ensure application quality for their product, Shopper MX, they've resulted in, over time, an 85% reduction in time spent doing manual testing. Or another way of framing that would be, over 6.5 times reduction in those manual test efforts. So, whether it is maybe even higher than that or a little bit lower than that, we still think no matter what, we're confident that the time saved and the money saved, therefore, is going to be substantial regardless.
Oh, those are impressive figures. I mean, do you think that is typical of the kind of improvements that adopters of test automation might be able to expect?
I can take that. And yeah, I do believe that. So we've seen a lot of different sort of sizes of teams, as John mentioned, different sort of backgrounds, different maturity levels, and whether or not it's a small team of even 2 to 5 indie developers to much larger studios, the reduction in manual testing effort is pretty significant. And this is not a gaming company, by the way, but it's worth noting that they're using the same technologies that gaming companies use. They're using Unity as their development engine. They're using the same source control management systems, GitHub, all of the same tooling. And they actually aren't a very large team either. We're talking maybe 3 to 5 testers at any given time working with developers to automate, again, some of that repetitive use cases, so that when they check in a build on a nightly basis using their Azure cloud, they can execute some 200-300 tests before getting feedback the next morning and handing that directly to the developer to say, from the recent build, here are the things that are working, here are the things that aren't. But most importantly, this allows the testers to focus on what's new and what's changed from each and every build. One of the reasons why we highlight in context quite a bit is that our gaming customers are quite tight-lipped at times. There's a lot of NDAs in this industry, and they don't like to share a lot of what they're doing or who they're doing it with. So this is one of the best examples we can give. So I want to elaborate a bit on the whole implications of the test automation and what we think increasing investment in this area how it can affect teams, and by reducing crunch time and even helping them to make better products. And so here's just a very simplistic chart showing the kind of testing over time, where we see the number of features over time increasing, pretty linearly, right? You add features, you complete sprints, and you're adding more functionality into your game, into your product. But the amount of testing that, again, any one person can do over time is pretty static. So the effort required to do that manual testing increases with the number of features. But with an investment early on into test automation, or even at the end of a cycle or release, when you're pushing a product into production and now you need to maintain its functionality, you need to make sure that things keep working. And if you're doing something like live ops, where you're adding new features on a regular cadence, weekly or monthly, you want to make sure that the new content that you're adding is not impacting previous developments. So that early investment in automation can help to avoid some of those issues further down the line. And the payoff is pretty short. So we've seen anywhere from 2 to 3 months to a couple of weeks where testers have been able to move a large percentage of their work into the automation pipeline, which really alleviates the pressure from them to have to perform those tests on a regular basis. It's a pretty short ramp up, as we've seen, as John mentioned. So whether you're talking about GameDriver or some other purpose-built solution that is more generic, the effort to go from manual to automated is not insurmountable. It's usually just a short effort by any individual tester's part, and it's not application development. Now, I know a lot of people see test automation, they go, oh, that's coding, and I'm not a coder, or my testers aren't coders. But the reality is it's really just an articulation of steps. It's saying, perform this step, perform this other step, and then check the result. And that's articulated using the programming language, but it's often quite easy to follow, quite easy to learn. And we find that, and myself included, I started off as a tester many years ago, moved into test automation, and so on. I'm not a developer, and I found that it was quite easy to move from one to the other space. The other important factor here is that test automation can be run in parallel. So let's say you have 50, 100, 200 tests built up in the library. You can execute those tests in parallel across any number of machines. And that's a benefit, again, that an individual tester can only test one console, one game at a time, whereas the automation doesn't have that limitation.
It's interesting that you touch on the point here about smoothing workload and reducing crunch. That's such a huge topic in the games industry these days. Is automation something that studios should be thinking about more to kind of help ameliorate crunch at the sharp end of projects?
Yeah, we recently gave a talk at Gamescom Asia on this subject specifically, and the gist of it is that crunch evolves from a toxic sort of workplace environment where there's a lot of pressure to deliver. And that pressure to deliver could be financially based, it could be time based, it could be just essential resource based, where you just have a limitation of one of those factors, right? And so that pressure results in people working longer hours, often to meet those deadlines so that they can, see the financial results that they're looking for, or avoid running out of money in many cases. And so test automation is one of those things that might not seem apparent to helping to resolve crunch, but it does help to reduce the amount of pressure put on developers, as you often have features, again, going into the testing pipeline. You want to get feedback on those features back to the developer as soon as possible. There's a ton of studies out there showing the later that you resolve, or the later that you identify a defect in an application, the higher the cost in resolving it. So if you can solve it in the requirements phase, it costs nothing because you change the requirement. If you can solve it during unit testing or development, it's very quick for the developer to fix. If you solve it in testing, it's again getting that feedback to the developer so that they can fix it very quickly. But if it goes out into production and now it's affecting your users, it's much more expensive to fix that issue once it's reached production, but it also has a greater impact in that you're affecting your users. So we do feel as though test automation is one of those small investments that a studio can make that really has a long-term effect on reducing crunch in the workplace. John, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I think you summed that up perfectly, Shane.
And so, again, I want to highlight that it's not about reducing the number of testers or even keeping testing to internal teams. Outsourcing agencies are a critical part of this industry, and we see that they provide a wealth of experience that can help teams ramp up quickly or transform their practices for greater efficiency. It's also a great way to expedite the adoption of test automation within a team, as a lot of teams lack that experience themselves, and so turning to an outsourced solution provider can help to onboard that process very quickly. We still think that people need to have hands on controllers, hands on keyboards in order to do that testing. And given that 54% of respondents claim that regression testing is done manually, there's an opportunity to really reduce some of that burden. We've talked to hundreds of clients and thousands in the industry since our inception. And we're really trying to alleviate the burden of testing. In one example that I can give, where we have a small studio with a very well-known game that took about 6 years to deliver. They had the one QA and one dedicated QA person, and then some outsourced testers as well. But the one QA person, having played the same game for 6 years, he said he was so bored after year 3, he was playing it on the Donkey Kong bongo drums just to keep himself occupied, and still finding issues along the way. So again, trying to reduce that burden so we can help testers to focus on what is important.
So it's really interesting there. I think it makes it sound like test automation is something we shouldn't be thinking about that as something that replaces or reduces the role of testers, more as something that empowers them, helps them to be more productive.
Yeah, we absolutely agree with that. That's really a driving mentality for us because, as has already been mentioned, aside from, the more monotonous forms of regression testing and things like that nature, it's still important to get controllers in hands to cover the more nuanced components of gameplay for polish. But to illustrate that point a little bit more, we've, since our inception and since getting out there more, we've had a couple of our own customers actually, in job descriptions, job postings, where they're hiring new staff for QA and testing roles. They've included as a preferred skill set or a bonus component, having GameDriver. Now, obviously, the obvious answer is because now that tool is part of their tech stack. But we also think it illustrates the point, which is, it's not about replacing anybody. It's not about cutting down the headcount. It's about, anybody that is coming in to these roles as these teams expand. It's just another thing to check off on the skill set sort of toolbox there. We think it's in the long term, aside from the benefits of an overall production, we also think it's something that can really bolster the strength and empower of the QA and testing talent pool going forward.
Yeah, it's a great point, John. And we've seen that a happy team is a productive one. And many case studies reflecting on the success of particular projects. And also by giving testers a better career path, we can help to reduce the burnout and churn in that space, which there's a lot of in the news lately around the unionization of testing, and trying to improve the quality of life for testers within the workplace, which can also be expensive to companies who'd otherwise need to hire and train new people as staff turns over in that organization. So you think about, bringing testers into your team, ramping them up, getting them used to your project and your processes, and then over a period of 6 months, a year, 2 years, that person burns out. Now you need to bring in another person and invest on them.
Apologies, I was struggling to unmute there. Happens to us all at some stage. But this very much ties back to one of the first slides in the survey, doesn't it? That the number one concern that came out of that for developers was hiring the best talent. And it sounds like this is a way of kind of reducing the burden of manual repetitive work and helping make those roles more interesting and more attractive for prospective talent.
Yeah, absolutely. I gave the previous example of that small game studio, and that person ended up leaving the team after that project because they were just burned out from the experience. But looking even deeper into this, the average salary of the tester in the United States is somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 a year, with only the top 86%, I believe, making over $100K. Whereas the median salary for an automation engineer is about $120K. And now a company might look at this and think, we can't afford that. But the reality is that these test automation engineers deliver significantly more value to the company that they're working for, which more than justifies that investment. And so we've seen many examples of games having poor quality due to launch issues, many in the media. I won't call out any names here. And the gaming industry is an interesting one because there's a game for everybody. Games tend to do well regardless of the genre, the style of play, the content, because gaming is not a net sum zero industry. It's something that people will consume, dozens or hundreds of games in a year. Myself included, I have a pretty huge library of video games that I've yet to complete. So there's one sort of common factor across the industry in that if a game is of a high quality, it tends to do well. And if a game is of a low quality, it tends to not do well. And this all ties back to like Metacritic scores and reviews, which, for better or worse, shows that people are interested in all kinds of content, but it really requires that the game be polished and delivered at a high level of quality. Now, until now, only large studios could afford to invest in test automation. Some of the largest have dedicated teams of engineers who are specialized in this area, and they can create a custom tool kit to provide to the developers so that they can implement a solution. Unfortunately, those solutions tend to only live as long as the project itself. And then when a new team and a new project is spun up, they need to solve that problem all over again. And so we're really trying to resolve that and provide a generic solution that can be used in a wide variety of projects, large and small. And so automation, we believe, represents a pretty significant shift in game development and testing, which can help you to reduce costs compared to manual testing only, as we've shown in the in-context example. We've seen it significantly improve time to market by helping developers and studios release faster by validating the quality of their products sooner. And surprisingly, it helps to lower overall maintenance costs. And so if you have one of these games that lives for a longer period, it's not just release and then it's done, which is quite common these days. Right? These games are tending to move towards the live ops model. Keeping the maintenance costs low means keeping the number of testers that are dedicated to that project low as well. This results in a more sustainable, healthier dev test pipeline where you have immediate feedback to your developers at each step along the release cycle. And as I mentioned, happier testers with better career opportunities makes for a happier workplace. And we've seen how this can impact or have an impact in reducing crunch in a team. And ultimately, the reason why we got into this in the first place is I love to play games and I want to play better games. And so I thought this was a great way for us to help the industry to do that. If anyone's interested in learning more about how we can help, please visit GameDriver.io today, and we can help you get started.
Great.
And that's it from us.
Thanks, John and Shane. That was some really great insights there. So we'll move now to the audience Q&A. So first question that we have is, how does automated testing handle the fun aspects of a game?
It can't. And so, yeah, the goal is not to handle all of the fun things, but to free up testers from doing the monotonous, repetitive things so that they can focus more of their effort on what makes the game fun, what makes it challenging, what makes it exciting. And that's really the focus.
Okay, so we have another question here from Brendan Fallon. Why do you think people shy away from automated test programming when there are other business tools out there that are programming? For example, Excel or BIS systems. Is it a framing problem, do you think?
I believe so. I believe it is a problem with framing of the tool itself, the value that can be achieved, and really just educating the market on what's available. You mentioned the BI tools, which any analyst in any organization would be lost without their BI solution, right? And so they learn that as part of their path to become an analyst. Whereas testers, at least in this space, have been or organizations, I should say, have been largely satisfied with keeping testing manual for over 30 years. And we're trying to change that. I come from an enterprise software background, and test automation has been commonplace there since the mid-90s, which is where I started in my career as an automated tester. And we've seen the impact that it had in that industry and how testing and test automation grew into a self-sustaining or sort of market on its own, where you have tens and hundreds of thousands of automated test engineers worldwide working in web applications, mobile applications, business applications of all kinds. And that is the assumed career path of the tester now, rather than I guess, not sure the word I'm looking for there.
Okay, and another question here from Sharik. How compatible or easy is it to automate old mobile platform games?
So now getting into the nuts and bolts, I think. Yeah, it depends on how old. So one of the things that really led to the creation of GameDriver, at least, was the proliferation of game engines. So engines like Unity, Unreal, Godot, really enable us to develop something that is generic and can be used in a wide variety of applications. Engines that are bespoke or older than these sort of commodity engines, a little more difficult, although there are studios that are still working in their own proprietary engine today that, given the chance to work with them, I'm sure we could make GameDriver work in that environment as well. That was the intention.
So I guess that is also probably the answer to another question. Is GameDriver supported on all currently sold consoles?
We go where the engine goes. And that was the design as well. So being portable means that if Unity works in an environment, we should be able to work in that environment as well. I won't speak to any specific consoles, but certainly if customers working in an environment where they're deploying their game, their application, then assuming we support the engine that it's built on, then we should be able to work with them as well.
Just to add on to that too, I don't think it's in the actual Q&A, but Shane, I know some people are concerned about some proprietary solutions if they're working with their own tool. What would maybe that implementation process look like?
Proprietary, like their own engine, you mean?
Yeah, their own engine.
Yeah. So again, and we've had some conversations with some larger studios regarding support for their engines, and it's generally a short runway for us in working with them to understand how things are implemented there. But yeah, we can make it work. More of a partnership.
Yeah. So maybe another question here that relates a bit to that is, at what stage of a project do you think test automation should be introduced? And what are the existing projects that are already ongoing?
Yeah. At what stage of a project? I think at any stage. Earlier, the better. And one of the consistent points of feedback that we've received from our customers is that they wish they'd started sooner, because that would have allowed them to build up the automation from a very low level. Oftentimes, games don't evolve as like one level at a time, but more like systems. And as you build up those systems of gameplay features, player controllers, physics, enemy behaviors, that sort of thing, you can build test automation around those things. And so the earlier, the better. But we've also seen the opposite case where teams wanted to reduce the amount of sort of manual testing that was done for an existing project. And so at any point, it can be introduced. It's really just depending on what is your focus and where are you looking to reduce efforts.
And does GameDriver help with multiplayer testing? Another question we have just come in.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we have many customers doing multiplayer testing using GameDriver.
Okay.
I won't get into too many technical details here.
Well, we have quite a technical question coming up, actually, so I'll give you a chance to dive into this one. So how much access to the source does GameDriver need to work? So, for example, test outsourcing isn't often given access to more than the binary.
Yeah, that is a great question. We do require access to the source of the game. And this has been a source of friction in some cases, but we working with those companies showed that if they simply give access to the source, let's say it's a Unity game, for example, to the testers, that they're not changing anything, they're not checking in source code, they're really just using it to explore and understand how things are implemented, and that this reduces the amount of kind of the feedback loop where they need to ask developers, how do you implement this button? How does this player controller work? What fields and what values are you looking for? By having that access to the source code in the editor, where a lot of the GameDriver's tools reside, prevents them from having to go back to the developer for every little thing that occurs. It also helps them to develop the test automation because we provide an easy way to capture the path to objects, capture object values, identify where in the scene or application things are happening, so that they can quickly develop their test automation from that. And every single time that we've worked with a company on kind of resolving that barrier from testers not having access, it has resulted in those testers having access.
So another interesting question here. How easy is it to use GameDriver for a non-technical person?
I'm probably biased here, but we aim for ease of use. The idea is that you should be able to ramp up in GameDriver and test automation fairly quickly. And as John mentioned in one of the slides, that we often see it's just a quick half-hour course in Udemy on how to structure tests or how to define your tests so that you're not having to throw away a lot of effort, and maybe just a look at Selenium or what's been done in the past, and then getting the hands dirty, I guess, with things like our tutorials and documentation. And of course, we aim for ease of use, but we've seen people from all skill sets coming in using GameDriver.
And if I may just say, as a marketer, so somebody who is not technically inclined, there are some components of it that I've been able to grasp and demonstrate for, live event purposes. We have sales staff who some are technical, some are less technical, that have been able to grasp a lot of the components and use it. So if those people can pick it up for those purposes, experienced testers who are, well integrated with, game development and testing, I'm sure can have not no problem picking it up, but certainly a lot more ease picking it up than people might think.
So you don't need your testers to become developers in order to be successful?
Definitely not. Yeah, definitely not. As I mentioned, Liam, what we saw in enterprise software, which is still true today, testing has evolved so that testers are no longer considered just the sort of hands-on keyboards to make things happen and find bugs. They're more, graduated into a whole discipline on its own, which has certifications, it has standards. There's a huge body of knowledge to pull from, which is not specific to any tool, not specific to GameDriver or any other. And so, we hope to help this industry, this gaming industry, leverage a lot of that knowledge through GameDriver.
Okay. So we've had another question just come in here. So is it possible to automate testing of platform-specific test scenarios like in-app purchases, generating interrupt-like phone call or internet on-off using GameDriver?
Yeah, absolutely. And we find this is quite common for studios who are looking to release on multiple platforms. You often have to deal with platform-centric features. And absolutely, quite common. You can build cases just for the console that you're working in that will only execute in that console automatically using certain techniques, build flags, that sort of thing, which allows you to turn those things on or off. And yes, to shortly answer what could be a very long discussion point. Yeah, absolutely.
So we have another question touching on the topic we were discussing a little bit earlier about game engines, different engines, proprietary engines, and so on. So how long does it take to pick up a new engine? So one of our attendees notes that your website says that GameDriver is in beta for Unity, Unreal Engine 4.
Yeah, and we chose that specifically because there's a huge number of projects that are already built in Unreal Engine 4, and they don't disappear because Unreal Engine 5 comes along. And so a lot of studios are going to be wrestling with, okay, we have these existing properties. How do we continue to maintain those while we move our new projects into Unreal Engine 5? From our perspective, going from Unreal Engine 4 to 5 is a very short walk. The engine updates are more tools focused on how to make the developer more productive and not in the underlying sort of framework for how the engine works. There's additional features there, of course, in the lighting and particles and nanites, I think, is one that's really exciting. A lot of people are using. But the underlying engine is the same. So from our perspective, it's a very short walk from one to the other. But we wanted to make sure that those investments in the existing projects, those existing games, wasn't completely lost, and say, okay, we're not going to focus on automation there because we've got these new projects in Unreal Engine 5. Well, those studios still have to maintain those projects. A lot of games these days live on for years or even decades.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I think we're almost ready to wrap up. We just have one quick question about your subscription licensing model. Do you do permanent licenses, subscriptions? How do you structure that?
It is a subscription license, which is quite common for tools these days. I come from a background of, as I mentioned, enterprise software, where years ago you could buy software permanently and own it in perpetuity. One of the challenges there is that you wouldn't get updates to that software. And so you were kind of stuck in a point in time. You could pay support, but that was your version. And then you would have to buy it again when the new version came out. And that's a model that I think the industry has long since moved away from, for better or worse. I understand there's downsides to both. But this allows us to provide consistent updates to our users, to provide new functionality, new features, without impacting the procurement model, and to get those features to our customers. Yeah,
I think there's no doubt that that's the way the world is heading, or has headed, really. So I think that's all of our questions for the Q&A. So that kind of brings us to the end of today's webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for your participation, for submitting your comments and questions, and also, of course, thank my co-presenters, Shane and John, for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you very much. An archived version of this webinar will be available shortly, so feel free to come back and view the session again, or to share with your colleagues via the link that you have already. A short survey will appear at the conclusion of the webinar. Please do take a few moments to fill that out. That always helps us to improve these webinars going forward. And make sure you follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for information on future webinars from OMDIA. Again, thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.